David, thanks for joining me today. Really looking forward to having this conversation with you.
Yeah, been looking forward to it.
Yeah, well, do what thou wilt should be the whole of the law.
Love is the law, love and will.
So we're recording, and we've got some people with us, and we're meeting today under the auspices of the Temple of the Silver Stars Northwest England Campus. I guess we should introduce ourselves just for those people who are going to watch this at a later date. I'm Andrew. I'm an instructor of the academic track of the Temple of the Silver Star. I'm talking today with Dr. David Shoemaker. I'll say a few things about you, David. You might want to add some as well, if there's anything important I missed, but you have worked on the publication and have authored several books. A couple of examples are Living Thelema, and more recently the Llewellyn's complete book of ceremonial magic, which you co-edited with Lon-Milo Duquette. And in that you've also written a chapter on Thelema and Aleister Crowley. You're the Chancellor and Prolocutor of the Temple of the Silver Star, and a Senior Initiate of OTO and AA. And you work as a clinical psychologist in private practice. I think those are the main things, but is there anything else that you'd like to add?
I think that's a pretty good professional slash magical summary there. So thank you.
Short CV, right. So we're talking today about perspectives on Thelemic Magick and Mysticism, particularly with practical aspects of Thelemic Magick and Mysticism. So the tools and techniques that we get acquainted with in our journey along the Thelemic path. So that's really the focus of our discussion. But I guess before we dig into that specifically, can you give us a sense of what we're aiming for when we're following a Thelemic path, when we're using these tools and techniques, what we're kind of shooting for? What's the reason behind using it?
Yes. What makes the Thelemic path, I think, is especially distinctive, and Crowley's approach to integrating the array of tools potentially available distinctive, is that it is keyed to the central process of discovering the true will. That's what makes it essentially Thelemic, as opposed to more broadly esoteric or occult or Western ceremonial or whatever. And what we mean by that, for those who are less familiar with that term, is that we take it to be true that each human being has an appointed path through life in the cosmos that is unique to them, that is an expression of their unique strengths and the circumstances into which they came into the world, and reflects their talents that can be best brought to bear on life and personally and in their work in the world with other people. And so the premise is that if each person does their best to discover this true will and live it out, then by definition, they will be living in a way that is most likely to be efficient and effective for them, and also harmonious in terms of their interactions with others. That doesn't mean there's no conflict ever, but when each person is striving their best to create a path that is honoring their true will, it is, in my experience, much less likely to have conflicts come up that feel like you're swimming upstream in your life. Often it feels much more like doors open when they need to, and if they don't seem to be opening, then later you discover why they needed to not be opening at that point. But the larger point I'm addressing here is that the meaning of the whole path, the purpose of the whole path in Thelema, no matter what magical tools you're using, no matter what mystical tools you're using, is to aim you toward the discovery of the true will for the betterment of yourself and of all humanity.
Mm-hmm. So we were going to go on to talk about a whole range of things from different traditions, which are kind of brought in and synthesized under this umbrella of Thelema. I guess in other contexts, they might be used for things which kind of fall short of that goal, in a sense. There might be kind of magical practices to acquire wealth and things like that. Mm-hmm. There's lots of books about that sort of thing.
Yeah. And I think a good way to understand that is that and I'm paraphrasing some various comments that Crowley has made on this. Until you know with more certainty your true will, any intentional magical working like that is practice. You are honing the magical muscles that eventually will be fully used, most effectively used when you know your true will. But until then, to a greater or lesser extent, it's a shot in the dark in terms of the magic you choose to work. You may have a pretty good sense that it's something important and essential to your path, but it is going to be maximally effective once there's more certainty of the true will. So there's lots of tools to try, and certainly we would never discourage anyone from experimenting with a large number of things. If you look at the systems of the Temple of the Silver Star and AA, there's staged training where you're acquiring these skills and practicing things, and so obviously you're not waiting to know your true will before you start doing magic. But it's just important to have the expectations in place.
Could we also talk just briefly at this point, before we get into these tools and techniques in a bit more detail, can we just talk about the Holy Guardian Angel as kind
Yes.
of another thing which we're aiming for?
Yes, and the Holy Guardian Angel is Crowley's term for that. Whether you consider it an aspect of self, like a higher self kind of idea, whether you consider it an external being that is truly an entity outside yourself that you're connecting with. The good news is you don't need to have that determined until you experience it yourself, and then you'll make up your own mind. But the Holy Guardian Angel idea is that we each have this center of self or center of spiritual connection external to us that is the key to understanding our true will. That when we are in conscious willed communication repeatably, reliably with the Holy Guardian Angel, we have a channel open to universal will flowing through us, particularized into our individual will, that enables us to fully live it out and understand it. So the knowledge of the true will and the attainment of what Crowley would call the knowledge and conversation of the Holy Guardian Angel go hand in hand in the system.
Yeah. So there's a clear kind of maybe not quite the right word, but a clear mystical dimension to that, in the sense of not just talking about something which at the psychological level.
Right.
There's a kind of transpersonal will that's.
Yes, when I speak of the universal will, I'm speaking of something that is transpersonal. And indeed, the true will itself, viewed in a certain way, is transpersonal in that it carries one through the arc of potentially multiple incarnations. If one believes that that's how the universe works, that there is a trans-egoic level of consciousness that is the seed of each human consciousness, and in a given incarnation, that seed expresses itself through creation of a personality that goes out into the world and lives and learns. But when that incarnation is over, that seed is still there, carried over. Right. So the trans-egoic level of true will is equally important. And I think for people to understand the path fully, a lot of it is getting that what we think of as ourselves before knowledge and conversation is just a tiny sliver, like the tip of the iceberg, to what we really are. And ceasing to identify only with that tip of the iceberg is such an essential and I think underrepresented, under-discussed aspect of this.
Yeah, that's great. I think that one of the things I liked, when I picked up Living Thelema years ago, was that you explained all these different practices and things in that context. So it kind of leaves somebody in no doubt to think as to why we might be using these different tools and techniques.
Yeah, I think we have language that we can use. We have a vocabulary largely drawn from Kabbalah, Kabbalistic psychology, which is so much less limited than what we think of as psychology in the mainstream today, in the sense that there's room for the superconsciousness and for the spiritual transegoic self in the Kabbalistic psychology system. So to me, and as someone trained in professional therapy, psychotherapy, the Kabbalistic psychology model is some of the most precise technology for understanding the self and growing and evolving in life that I've ever encountered.
Yeah, to include that superconscious element, I guess,
right,
really explains a lot, and also gives you a model which you can integrate into with regular psychological concepts, I guess.
Right, and Carl Jung, who's someone I admire and whose work I work with a lot, made room for that superconsciousness as well, except he often, he termed it the collective unconscious, and also early on, the objective psyche, which is a term people often forget about. He is saying a psyche is there and it is shared and by humanity, and yet his theory, he was so intentionally trying to keep it. I am a psychologist. I am not a mystic. I'm not a theologian. I'm not telling you what's true or not in terms of religion, but here's what the mind is about at these levels. Within Kabbalistic psychology, there's space in there for the superconsciousness to actually contain that contact point between matter and spirit, or between the adept and the spiritual world, however you want to see it, which is beautiful.
Wow. So in terms of getting to really to the crux of what we're talking about today, this practical training, or this practical pathway, I noticed in Living with Thelema, and also more recently in your chapter in the Llewellyn Ceremonial Magic book, you talk about different tracks, sort of putting the practices in different categories almost, and looking at how they work in parallel. And I find that really interesting, because it kind of gives a rationale for why certain things are done at certain times and how different practices work together. So I'd be kind of interested, if you were pleased, in if you could describe to us these different tracks, and then we'll build from there.
Yeah, I think a handy model for that in this context is probably to look at it elementally, because that folds into the Tree of Life, the Kabbalistic Tree of Life, as a system of initiation, like we see in Temple of the Silver Star and in AA and in other organizations. So instead of getting too jargony with it, but keeping it practical, let's just look at it elementally. Okay, so you need, let's say there's going to be at least 4 tracks we're talking about here, to have a balanced self that can be prepared for the encounter with the Holy Guardian Angel. And remember, that's the goal. That's the point of doing all of this. So Earth as an element on the tree, that's Malkuth. We need to learn the physical forms of ritual, magical ritual. We need to learn the traditions, the correspondences, the things that make practical magic in the physical world work the way it does. We need to put some focus on the health and training of the body, also an earth type of thing. So we start practicing asana, posture in the yoga tradition. Some preliminary work with pranayama and breathing, mostly that comes later. But think of it as the form stage of training, the form track, okay? Then if we move to what we might call the theoretical track, or the energetic track, corresponding to Yesod on the Tree of Life, this is where we start bringing some force into that form, and thinking and working more about how to sort of power up ourselves as we go along. We don't just have empty forms, we have energized empty forms, energized forms. So we start working more intensively with pranayama, the breath control practices from the yogic tradition. This is stirring what we might term the Kundalini force, or the life force. And you know, you'll see with each of these tracks, with each of these aspects of training, if you think about it, it's evident why that has to be there for knowledge and conversation to be successful when using this model, because you need to have the forms in place. You need to have a reliable relationship to ritual and to the way to organize your thinking and aim it, you know, where you want it. You need to have the power in the room. You know, it's like I use a lamp metaphor. Like if you need to build the lamp first physically, and then you need some oil for the lamp. That's what we're talking about with the sort of air phase of the power. Then we move to water. Water might seem like an odd element for what I'm about to describe, but the idea is, remember, this is the sphere of Hod on the tree of life. So it's the magician, Mercury, the idea of that go-between between the inner and the outer worlds, Mercury, the messenger, and so on. And as a magician, we have to have one hand in the realm of the gods, if you want to think of it that way, and another hand in the realm of the practical world, the material world. And therefore, to do that, we have to make our mind and our entire selves a mirror of higher force. We have to make, you know, as above, so below, as it is said. We have to be able to work within ourselves to make outer change occur. That's the essential definition of magic in many ways. And so once we've got the forms in place, once we've got the power starting to flow, then we have the next phase attributed to water, which is making that flow go where we want it to in ways that matches universal patterns, that is in harmony with the universal patterns and reflects our understanding that the within us is a mirror of the without, and vice versa. So then the fire part of this, the fire track that corresponds to Netzach on the tree of life, is about devotion and aspiration, and that fire of emotion that we need to train. And the purpose of this, I like to think of it as the flame that we bring to the wick on the lamp that we've been making ourselves into. The structure's there, the oil's there, the relationship of the parts is there, and then we need the fire to light it. And that fire at this stage of training is about the aspiration, just the yearning for the angel, the passion to connect with that angel in whatever form that ends up taking. It's no accident that a lot of the metaphors we tend to use when we talk about encounters with the angel and that sort of entity are sexual or romantic in nature. You know, you have the Sufis talking about the beloved. You have many metaphors in tantric work that involve sexual union. Knowledge and conversation are both archaic terms for sexual union. So there's a lot here about harnessing the force of union with the opposite in a sexual or romantic or loving way that is in play here. So at that stage, you've done the 4 tracks. The lamp is lit and awaiting, and then awaiting is exactly what's next. If you want to have a 5th track, it's having the space, holding that space, so that the angel can indwell you. And I do think of it sort of like you're making yourself into a talisman of the angel. So just like if you're making a physical talisman, you want it to have all the symbols that attract the force, or symbolize at least the force that you're wanting to have it be a talisman of a particular element or planet or whatever. So just the same as that, we're making ourselves into a talisman that will naturally attract the angel. And to do that, we've needed to go through these different tracks of sort of getting ourselves in right relationship to all of our parts, and really being suitable as a dwelling place for the angel. The saying is, when the temple is aright, the God will indwell.
Yeah.
So that's a summary.
Great, thank you. There's a lot that's interested me there, but one of the things in particular was this. You talked about waiting, and I was kind of thinking, well, after all that work, and often in many cases lots of years of practice and disciplined practice at these different things, ultimately then it comes down to a point where the preparation has been done, and what is left is to wait. And I guess I'm probably picking up on that because I've been thinking a lot about a lot of traditions have this kind of more contemplative side to them, where it's a case of letting everything settle and quieten down and just trying to hear the voice of the divine, or however that's conceptualized in a different tradition. But it's a similar thing, I guess, in kind of becoming silent and waiting.
Yeah, and actually that's an element of the training that I probably underemphasized in what I was just saying, that sort of meditative component where becoming skilled not just in focusing the mind, but in quieting the mind. And then in that space, getting better at hearing what the angel is saying to us.
Right.
I do believe and have experienced in myself and others that it's like the angel is, I've used this metaphor a lot. The angel is a radio station that's always playing. And our task is not to sort of make it start playing. It's always playing. Our task is to tune in to what's always there, to be able to go back to that station anytime we want to and listen, and to remember where it is, and to know how to tune into it, and to know the difference between that station and all the others, and static, and all of those kind of metaphors. And in that, I think there's a lot about receptivity to what is always there, more so than, and always there available within us, more so than the kind of journey metaphor that we often see here. You're not going somewhere else, you're going to your quintessential self here. So I think that's important too.
Yeah, I guess that makes quite a difference in terms of how we view the path. Whether we think we've got to acquire something we don't have already, or whether it's just a case of revealing what's already there.
Revealing, uncovering, clarifying, purifying, consecrating, putting to right use. It may feel like finding something that wasn't there before because we were unconscious of it, but that's the way learning happens, right? When we learn something new about ourselves, it's not that it just started happening. It's been a process inside us, and we've just gained consciousness of it, so it feels new.
Yeah. And Crowley was one of its great innovations, really, was to bring these kind of yogic and Buddhist practices, the kind of thing you're talking about, where we learn to quieten the mind, and to work that side by side alongside the ceremonial magic.
Right.
So lots of things, lots of practices which move us towards that end, focusing and quieting the mind.
Yes, and different people will find themselves especially responding to one and not as much to another, and so on. But the key with this system is that you always are forced, in order to advance through it, you're always forced to work on things that don't come as naturally to you.
Mhm.
So it builds in some balance. Someone might be very intellectual leaning and need to have some encounters with things that loosen that up a bit, to have something that's more devotional and just visceral and powerful.
Sure.
Whereas the reverse may be true too. There's plenty of people who have a kind of intuitive, very open and Dionysian kind of approach to ritual and life and so on, and they might need to be kind of tightened up in certain ways in terms of learning forms and patterns and memorizing things and so on. But eventually, all the tools work together. The gears work together like a machine.
Right. And going back to that metaphor for a minute of the lamp and the kind of the fire or the light and the heat which the lamp produces. I'm thinking back to when you talked about Kundalini and the energetic practices earlier on as well. Kundalini often also is called a fire, is a thought of in terms of fire. Mm-hmm. And in your chapter in the Llewellyn book, the Ceremonial Magic book, you talk about Kundalini as almost like a fuel, which fuels the whole process.
Right.
Could you just say a little bit more about that? How it does it? What are the kind of some of the ways that manifests?
Sure. So, Kundalini is just one word for what many traditions, discuss in terms of having a life power, a life force. The idea in the Thelemic expression, at least, and elsewhere too, is that this is the same creative, divine life force that created all manifest reality, but it flows through us as well. Even the word tantra implies a web or a weaving process, and so the way I think of it is that this Thelemic tantra approach is enhancing our consciousness of the fact that we are woven together with all in the universe all the time. It is all a web of energy and life. And what we seek to do in this approach is to make ourselves a more open channel for Kundalini, to safely learn how to increase our ability to be a battery of that force, to let it flow through us toward the magical aims that we intend, and eventually to unite this sort of devotional, fiery life force stuff with the specific aim of union with the Holy Guardian Angel. So it's almost like Kundalini in this context is a necessary but not sufficient aspect of the path toward the HGA. That you got to have the fuel there, but you also have to have the specific technology of putting that fuel to use in the right way.
Right. Yeah.
With the right aim, with the right intention for you. It's not like there's one right answer that you have to figure out. It is like that, but it's your right answer, and for each of us, and it's incredibly particularized. But I think that's the basic stance on what is Kundalini. How does it work in this kind of a context for us?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, again, lots written about Kundalini, and it would be easy to go and pick up a book, but not understand it, or to learn from it, but not really understand how it's applied in the Thelemic context and the kind of path that we're talking about.
Right. Yeah. And Crowley's original writings, reference it in the discussions of pranayama and the results that are expected there in terms of the fine sweat on the body and the spasmodic trembling and all of that. But those are, they're ways that we test success in pranayama, but the reason that they are there as tests of that is that it relates to Kundalini activity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, all these things we're talking about now are straight out of, many of them are out of Liberi and Libero, which Crowley kind of was very brief in terms of describing the practices, but also why we might do them. So
right, and you can look at 8 lectures on yoga for a lot more fleshed out kind of discussion of that, and plenty of other modern yoga books as well.
yeah. I was thinking also, I mean, at the beginning we talked about psychology and the psychological perspective on this sort of thing. Sometimes people, the criticism I hear about magic sometimes is people say, oh, it's mostly psychology or whatever. I always feel that's a bit unfair, because we, no matter how enlightened or developed we become spiritually, if that's the right way to think about it, but no matter how far we go on that path, we have thoughts and emotions still. So I think personally, I think the psychological level is a very important thing to address. I'm kind of wondering.
That's right.
Yeah. Whilst we live and breathe, we're always going to be experiencing the world through a psychological perspective.
That's right. We're never going to not have to worry about the body being there. That We've always got to contend with. I mean, as long as we're alive, we're all going to have to deal with the body being there, and the mind, the personality level of consciousness is always going to be a filter or a lens through which all experience is processed. So you can't just ignore it. What I think is strange, and I in particular in my path I've encountered this a lot, is the way when you start to describe magic with a sort of nuanced psychological perspective, how quick people are to accuse you of making it all psychological. And you don't see that as much with approaches that are informed by other disciplines. For example, Crowley talks a lot about the mathematics of Kabbalah and the way the concepts of pure number can be applied to these metaphysical principles that relate to the tree of life and so on. But no one's saying, oh, Crowley just made it all about math. It's just one angle on the process. And so psychology is one angle on the process. It happens to be the one that comes fairly easy to me, so I talk about it that way. But I'm putting this out there because I want to set the record straight for people who made this criticism of my work. But I've never ever anywhere said it's all psychology. There's no actual gods or spirits or any of this magic stuff. It's all just in the mind. I never said that. I never implied that. It's just often the language I'm using is psychological. So I think that probably addresses some of the basics of your question there.
Yeah, and I was thinking also, in addition to describing things in a way where there's a kind of a psychological explanation as part of the description of them, there are also psychological tools that can be brought into this kind of work. Some of which come from a Jungian perspective, I guess.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if there's anything you can say about those, because
sure. Most broadly, simply self-analysis, being self-aware of the patterns of our personality is essential, because once again, the personality is the lens through which everything's going to be filtered. And if we don't know what that lens, if we don't know where the distortions are, if we don't know where it bends, if we don't know how it changes light, to strain this metaphor, then we're going to be missing the boat. We're going to be missing stuff. We're going to be misconstruing stuff. So you have to work on it broadly and understand yourself. More specifically, tools like working with psychological projections onto the world is a way of clarifying that lens of the psyche, to expose our own illusions, to expose how we expect the world or treat the world, as if it is a mirror of ourselves. And when we're doing that unconsciously, we are more prone to miss important truths about ourselves, to misunderstand the way we distort reality, and then find ourselves more confused and more prone to problems. So general self-analysis, psychological projections, and maybe I should say a little bit more about what projection is. So let's say you really don't like the idea that you might be mean sometimes, but you're trying to not think about that too much. You're trying to not encounter your potential for meanness or your actual meanness in ways. So there's a part of you that doesn't like that and wants to police it and wants it to stop. So when someone else is mean in some way, you might have kind of an overreaction emotionally to their meanness. Now, no one likes when someone else is being mean, but there's a hook there that we hang our own stuff on, and that's the projection. And so if I'm really not okay with the idea that sometimes I'm mean, I'm more likely to get pretty reactive when someone else is. So if I notice my own reactivity and I question it and I say, why did I respond so intensely to what just happened? I've learned that, oh, okay, I was, that little police person in me was wanting to be able to tell someone else they shouldn't be mean, and that way I don't have to direct that gaze at myself. I don't have to police myself. So in a way, it's an ego protection mechanism where we get to do the judging or do the policing of others without it hurting. That energy gets to flow. It's a release. Feels good because those bad people out there, you know, we got to point at them. But once we realize we're doing that and can bring it back home, we realize that what we're doing is offloading a part of ourselves we don't care for, and we need to own it instead. So shadow projections, disown parts of the self, that's a significant element here, working with that. And when all is said and done, what we've done is that we not only know ourselves better, but we make it more likely that we can see the world clearly. And if we want to change the world, we better see it clearly first.
Yeah, I was wondering if you were going to mention shadow work as part of that. Having done a little bit of that psychological projection work myself, it certainly feels like it's not particularly pleasant at times, and it feels like you're kind of dealing with a lot of shadow type stuff. But I was reminded also that there's that phrase, I can't remember the exact phrase about there being gold in the shadow. That ultimately you do all this kind of work and you find a nugget of gold in there somewhere.
Right, we're just as likely to project assets, positive things onto other people. Whenever you are around somebody and you hear yourself thinking something like, man, I could never be as good as they are at that, you know, or I wish I could have my life together like they do, or, you know, something where you're idealizing this other person's self or attainments or something. You've just projected your own gold onto them, you know. And once you realize that, then maybe instead you can say, hey, they're really good at being themselves. That's what I'm seeing. Maybe I could just get better at being myself, and that's just as important as them being themselves, you know. You take it out of the realm of I want to be someone else or be more like them or I couldn't be like them, to maybe having something from their gold resonate with your gold, that allows you to evolve in a way that opens you up more. And so that's another traditional phrase that from alchemy, that it takes gold to make gold. Someone else's gold is kind of contagious, you know, and resonates with us in a new way.
Yeah. It's this whole part of the discussion around psychological work is reminding me of the philosopher Ken Wilber, the transpersonal. Well, I don't know how he described himself, but the transpersonal philosopher, I guess. And he talks about this whole thing about waking up. You know, a lot of all this different spiritual traditions, there's this whole emphasis on waking up, of course. But he notices a lot of people who have awoken aren't necessarily psychologically healthy, and then go on to do loads of, quite often there's high profile examples in different traditions where, spiritual leaders then do something which is quite counterproductive to their own standing and their own communities, really. And Wilbur kind of says, just because somebody's woken up doesn't exactly necessarily mean they've done this psychological work as well. And it just, it goes to underscore really how important it is if we're going to develop in a balanced manner, not just in this sort of waking up dimension.
Yeah, when people don't have I call it the infrastructure, when they don't have that psychological infrastructure from doing that work, then a bolt of lightning from one thing or another, whether that's a spontaneous Kundalini event or often psychedelic use, I've seen, if they don't have the infrastructure there, then they're getting a lot of vision of things, but implementation is going to break down because they haven't worked on themselves enough. That doesn't mean that there aren't plenty of people out there who have done amazing work and gone far in the path without formal training, that they've just somehow they've done the training informally, evidently, because they're able to connect all the gears in the right way. But I think it's generally, for most people I've encountered, a bit safer and more effective and more efficient too, in the long run, to buckle down and do this work to build that infrastructure in a systematized way, so that when the bolt of lightning hits, it's hitting a system that knows what to do with it.
Right. Yeah, I was going to ask you about that actually, because we're talking here about some fairly structured systems. We've been given a map, really. Crowley set this out in a progressive manner. But really, I mean, we can go onto a website or a bookstore and we can get a book on something that's fairly advanced and start to work with it. I always feel that it's important to do things in a progressive manner, and then certain practices make more sense if you're doing them at the right time.
And it's often the case that if we're not ready for something, we just don't get it. It doesn't make sense to us, or it doesn't appeal to us as much, or it just doesn't work when we try it, and therefore we keep working on whatever else we needed to build up before reapproaching it potentially down the road. This connects with a criticism I sometimes hear about structured training, where people are understandably eager, and I think probably ambitious younger people are doing this a little bit more often, but they, how long does it take to work through the system to get to the Holy Guardian Angel? How long do I have to devote to this? And when they hear that, maybe we'd spend 3 or 4 years in the first order of TOTSS, and then Temple of the Silver Star, and then you do some work beyond that in the second order. And for me personally, it was I was in this training 11 years before my HGA experience, and people hear things like that and feel like it's too slow, like they just want it to happen sooner. And of course we want it to happen sooner, but what happens often is that people don't realize that if you don't do it in a more careful way, one way or another, informally or formally, you may feel like you're going faster. You may try more advanced things right out of the gate, as you were alluding to, But that doesn't mean you're going to get the result faster. It might just mean you try more advanced things instead of building up the foundations, and end up taking longer than you would have taken if you just built the foundations first. So wanted to address that. I think we had a comment in the chat. Maybe we can hold this for Q&A after. I'll keep the chat window open there.
Yeah, let's do that. I just wanted to ask you one more question, actually, and then maybe we can open this up to see if there's some other questions and address that comment. And maybe this is a little bit personal, so yeah, see what you think of this. But I'm kind of interested in, you know, what are some of the practices for you have really sort of resonated with you as you've been doing them, out of this whole array of practices that we're given?
Sure. No, that's a great question. Well, there's no question that the basics of ritual and meditation, once I started doing them regularly, almost 30 years ago, just unlock. I mean, that's the stuff that really began the journey for me, and still is the foundation of it all. Just to be able to go into a room, my own temple, or with others working with other initiates, and create a space that brings in a certain kind of force that wasn't there before, that can be tailored to the specific thing we're trying to do, and to see it change myself and others and the world efficiently and reliably. That blows my mind, and it still does to this day. To be able to sit in meditation and have, or scrying, those sorts of mystical practices, to be able to sit in that environment and have experiences, ideas, a flow of information that clearly feels like more than I could have come up with my own everyday personality, psyche, brain. That never ceases to amaze me. That's accessible, and that the real tangible feeling is this came from something more than me. Whether that's, someone else can now take the psychologist role and tell me whether they think that's just me accessing different parts of my own psyche, or whether that did come from outside me. But that's always powerful for me. Specific practices, I found the Enochian system really personally very, very helpful, and both working with the elemental tablets in the context of the initiatory system in Temple of the Silver Star, in the scrying of the 30 Aethers, which bore fruit in terms of my Winds of Wisdom book, and also many of the ways that Temple of the Silver Star has grown over the past 15 years. And that some of the material that came through in those visions from the 30 Aethers informed the growth of the order and symbol systems and practices within the orders. So again, things that I don't really think I could have come up with purely on my own, but that seemed to be presented, and then my task was to figure out how to use it. So I don't want to go on too long on this, but I think that's a great question. I probably could go on a long time just thinking about the different things that have been really helpful and interesting for me, but that's the basic answer that comes to me.
Great, thank you. We've covered a tremendous amount of ground actually in the last sort of 40 minutes or so. Let's see what we have in terms of any questions, and we'll begin with this one in the chat. So I'm going to read this out. So I have this idea. This is a question from B. I have this idea that depression could be described as a lack of magical energy, and anxiety as too much magical energy, but with no proper direction, or maybe lack of infrastructure, as you mentioned. Would you care to comment on that?
I don't think that's a total explanation, but I think that's a really good partial explanation, like it like experientially when we're depressed, it certainly feels like, where's the juice, right? I need more. And when we're anxious, it sometimes feels like there's too much of it and it's bouncing around inside us like ping pong balls, and that has nowhere to go, constructively. Within that, there could be a lot of other things operating, of course, like, and maybe this just is semantics, but if we're telling ourselves in our heads, thinking in terms of cognitive therapy, we're telling ourselves in our heads that we're a terrible person 10 times a day, then we're probably depressed partly because that's how we talk to ourselves. Now, one could argue that in doing so, we then cut ourselves off from life force, and then that's the same thing. When I deal with people with anxiety, a lot of the time, I do find that there's some trapped energy from other emotions in there, like anger, that is just contained and has nowhere to go. And one way to think of anger, of course, is that there's been some life force that's been trying to direct itself to change something or to push back against something, and that's not being allowed, so it's all kind of pent up there. So I'm just kind of free associating here, but I think that there's definitely some really important principles in what B is getting at there.
Yeah, thank you. So if there's any other questions from our listeners right now, there's an opportunity to ask them. I'm just going to maximize this so I can see everybody.
I have a question, if that's okay. I'm trying to find the hand, but I can't find it anywhere.
That's fine. Speak up.
All right. So this is something I've talked with Andrew before, and it's actually about, it's taking the cue from the practical approach we're taking with the conversation today, to find space for the practice daily, like that struggle to build a daily practice. You've just said that it took somewhat 11 years for you to have contact with your HDA, if I understood correctly. So that's 11 years of practice, if I'm not wrong. So how would one, or any tips you can give to build a solid daily practice, just to find the time for it? Because sometimes I struggle with it. I have very long practice periods, but then some way or another I have to stop my daily practice, and then I resume, then I have a longer period, and then I stop again. So that's one of the questions. And then when I have another one, but I will let you answer to this one if you can. Thank you.
When you say you have long periods of daily practice, do you mean that the daily practice periods are long, or do you mean that you go for days or weeks or months?
There I go for months.
Practice.
Interrupted, yeah. Okay. There I go for months and it's uninterrupted.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, everyone has cycles of time when they're able and motivated to, and those two coming together is very important. When they're able to make things click on a regular basis and they really get that daily practice done, and other times when life circumstances make it harder or sometimes impossible to do. I think one of the keys is setting our expectations for something that's really reasonable instead of getting ahead of ourselves. So at the beginning of the path, really, we're just talking about, if it's half an hour a day total, like let's say someone's doing Libre Resh as a basic practice, and maybe the pentagram ritual or some other kind of basic cleansing, power up kind of ritual, and keeping a diary. All that together across the space of a day, probably about half an hour. There's not too many days when that time isn't actually there for most people. I think we can find times on most days to do that, but sometimes that's where the motivational part comes in. We're feeling busy, we're feeling run down, and like anything else, like exercise or something, on those kind of days, it's going to be harder to do that stuff. And sometimes we have to push ourselves to do it anyway. We have to tweak our expectations, adjust our expectations so that we can remember that we feel better if we feel super tired, but we make ourselves go in and do 10 minutes of ritual. It's better that it's going to feel better that we did it, even if it isn't our best. If it's not the most earth-shattering, amazing ritual work we've ever done every time. Let it be okay to have some days that are mediocre, but keep up the practice. Put a note in the diary every day, even if that note says, I did a crummy job of keeping a diary today and didn't do much, fine. But at least you've kept the discipline of keeping the diary. So a lot of this is about self-discipline and letting your expectations ebb and flow with the cycle that you're in. But it's a challenge for everybody, and just getting the routine and sticking with it and keeping the diary is I'd say by far the most common kind of challenging hurdle that people encounter early in the path and really throughout. So I hope that's somewhat helpful.
Definitely. Thank you very much. Definitely the motivational part is on point. Yeah. So that's great. That's a great tip. Thank you. So the other follow-up question I had was that sometimes in my particular case, when I do practice, when I have my daily practice, then I feel like the rest of the day, there's also a second part that requires us to be aware, right, of our thoughts, or our emotions, or the way we behave ourselves. That it's not just practice and disconnect from it, but it's actually a process that extends throughout the rest of the day. So I don't know if there's something like mindfulness, for example, that can be applied in this kind of scenario that I'm talking about.
That's right. And really what we're saying there is that the practice extends throughout the day. It's not only that there's practice and then other stuff in life that's also important. It's that the practice of staying mindful throughout all that other stuff is part of the practice. Being able to know when we're working in the garden that we are doing the great work and reflecting on what that part of our day means. Being aware when we're driving to the office that we're doing the great work. And not artificially separating, like, oh, I'm a magician when I go in the temple for that 20 minutes when I'm doing some ritual, and then I come out and I just do other stuff during the day. You gotta let the whole day, your whole life, be your practice. And part of that process of discovering the true will and living it out is then constructing a life that allows you to more effectively have that mindful practice approach to everything you do, because you've shaped your life to be full of things that elicit that. If that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you very much. Thank you. I love that reflection of I'm doing the great work, whether I'm driving to work or doing the dishes. So that definitely. Thank you so much.
course. One thing that's encoded in Crowley's writings and practices that relates to this is this saying "will" at meals. This is obviously he was contrasting will with grace, but the point there is this mindfulness of I am eating now, but the reason I'm eating now is because I want to fortify my body so that I am better able to perform the great work. And the same sort of mindful approach to other life tasks is available to us. So anything from brushing the teeth to my example of working in the garden or driving to work, it is my will to drive to work so that I may replenish my financial resources so that I have ease to put more energy into writing this book, which is an important part of my great work, or whatever it is. So I think I've made the point there.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much.
Of course. Other questions? I think we may have arrived at a natural pausing place, Andrew.
I think we have, if that's the extent of our questions, and I think we shall wrap up. I'm kind of wondering though, David, if this potentially could be seen by quite a number of people on the YouTube channel, and if anybody's interested in finding out a little bit more about your work or the Temple of the Silver Star, where would you direct them to?
Let's talk about that. So there's a lot of training resources out there, some informal and some formal. On the informal side, of course, all the Living Thelema podcasts that I've done over the years are on the Living Thelema YouTube channel and are still available as podcasts as well through livingthelema.com. And if you just enter Living Thelema on YouTube, you'll be brought to that channel, which is called Living Thelema. So that stuff's out there and available, the book, of course, as well. But on the formal side, Temple of the Silver Star can be accessed at TOTSS.org. There's an FAQ on there, frequently asked questions section that I think is good to review. Online applications. Members can join from anywhere in the world as long as you can travel at least once per year or so to one of our initiating locations. Which at present are in the UK, East Coast, and the West Coast of the United States. But we have members all over the world, and don't let geography stop you. Then for AA, our access portal that we would point you to is onestarinsight.org, and that's always available to people. Both Temple of the Silver Star and AA include a great deal of foundational training in magic and mysticism, and are both designed to lead one to knowledge and conversation of the Holy Guardian Angel. But AA is a solitary path where you only work with one teacher, and Temple of the Silver Star is an initiatory order that has a social component in the sense of doing group ritual together and advancing through a more structured system based on the Tree of Life and the Golden Dawn framework. So lots of resources out there, and I think those websites and videos and all of that are probably good places to turn.
Great, thank you. Well, it's been fascinating having this conversation today. Really appreciate your time. I think,
of course,
the breadth of material that we've covered, it's been really interesting, but also to think about some of these specific practices to get as well and how it all fits together. I really appreciate that. I'm sure anybody listening to this will learn a lot as well. So thank you.
Absolutely. Happy to be here, and thanks for organizing it.
You're welcome. So we'll say goodbye then.
All right. Thanks for joining us, everyone, here today. It's great to see some familiar faces and new ones. And thanks to everybody down the road who may be watching this on YouTube or elsewhere for taking a look. So Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law.
There is law, love, and the will.